This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. And this is your brain on Zero Time Dilemma. Zero Escape, Zero Time Dilemma is the third game in a series that's a mix-up between Saw, Professor Layton, and hardcore hallucinogenic drugs. And surprisingly, you should expect that coming out of a Spike Chunsoft game, with their history of games like the Danganronpa series. It does make me question exactly what goes on at their headquarters and their working requirements, however. But regardless, Zero Time Dilemma comes out today on the PC. The game came out yesterday on the 3DS and PlayStation Vita, and it sells for $39.99. I played the game for 22 plus hours, and beat the game with its true ending. So, does the game keep your heart rate up, keeping you at the edge of your seat, to the point where you're about to fall on your ass? Or will the game's dark tone and chaos work against itself, and end up putting you in a permanent coma of boredom? That's what I'm here to find out. But before I begin this spoiler-free review, this key was obtained from the publisher for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? Let's start with the story, because it's the heart and soul of this series, with it being part visual novel and part puzzle game. And boy, is this one a doozy. 9 people awake and find themselves trapped inside a nuclear bunker and locked behind something called the X Door. They've been put there by the mysterious Zero, who goes all jigsaw on them and wants them to play a game. The way they escape the bunker is simple. They need 6 X passes, and they need to enter them into a computer to open the door to the outside world, leading to their escape. Simple, right? Just find the X passes and get out. Sounds like a great time, actually, like a cool scavenger hunt. Hell, I want to play the game. Well, the only way to get the X passes is if someone dies. And thus, a deadly game begins, as the 3 teams are placed against each other. C team made up of Carlos, Akane, and Junpei. D team made up of Diana, Sigma, and Phi. And Q team made up of Miri, Eric, and the mysterious Q. The race is on to figure out not only who will survive the events within the bunker, but what the true intentions behind the game are. See, this isn't just a story about 9 people fighting for their right to exist, as the game introduces various plot points regarding those involved, and how their death or escape from the bunker could change the fabric of the human race. No, these characters aren't the Green Arrow or meta-humans or famous scientists. I won't obviously go into how they change things, because, well, that's spoiler territory. But to the story's credit, it makes the situation and their possible effects on mankind believable. Well, as believable as a game like this can be, without it being hopelessly boring. One of the first things that the game introduces to you is the fact that it's told in a strange and odd presentation. Every so often you'll be asked to make a decision within the game. For example, the game opens with you guessing a coin flip. Depending on your answer or the will of the game, you can go along one of a few branching pathways of a timeline. These fragment timelines lead to different variations of the game's plot, and that's where things get interesting. You can jump between these story segments, experiencing different viewpoints, or even different versions of the plot. You won't have everything unlocked at first in terms of the playable segments, and you don't have a lot of information about these segments at first either, as the default presentation of the fragments are mixed up in terms of choices. You may end up playing a fragment towards the end of a timeline, before a segment starting it, or playing 2 concurrent ones with both teams back to back. For you anime fans out there, think the first season of Haruhi Suzumiya. But okay, enough setup. How is the story? Is it as good as Danganronpa 2, which I praised as one of the best written games I've played in a long while? Sadly, no, at least from my perspective. Now don't get me wrong, the writing here is good. It's a solid Class A burger in a fancy restaurant. It's just, well, Danganronpa 2 is the T-bone steak. And no, I'm surprisingly not hungry during this review, despite the analogies used. If you're looking for sheer, jaw-dropping moments in terms of the plot, there is no question that Zero Time Dilemma has you covered, because that's where the story shines the brightest. There's more drama here than an episode of Maury and Jerry Springer put together. And unlike those shows, I'm actually interested in what this plot has to say, and it doesn't devolve into the lowest common denominator. You will feel for these characters and what they have to go through, without the game pulling cheap tactics to pull on your heartstrings. Sure, you'll be surprised at several points, as the game does do some misdirection, but it never feels like it was done to mislead, but to hit a knockout punch. This is especially true when it comes to the ramp up to the climax and its finale. A good amount of the beginning of the game is setting up the events of what happens in its final act. Not to say that the events in the beginning are boring, as they still are interesting. But the climax, it's just one uppercut after another, as you try to keep up with every card that the game is laying out on the table. It's satisfying, although it can overwhelm you very quickly. My notes while playing the final 4 hours became a series of oh my gods and WTFs, and I wouldn't really want it any other way. One thing to know though, if you have trouble with complex stories, in particular with juggling tens of subplots, Zero Time Dilemma is going to be a nightmare for you. It is easy to get lost with all that happens, who characters are, what groups are which. That is a dehancer in my scoring system, and it'll come up later in the scoring section of this review. Writing-wise, I also like the duality that Spike Chunsoft approached this plot with. Every decision made has a reasonable argument for both sides of the equation, and even the more darker motives of the game are well handled in terms of explaining the rationale behind them. It does a great job of putting you in the position of the character, and what really works here is the 3-team system. Because you have to play from the perspective of every team, knowing that your decision will cause issues for others really does enhance the plot overall. Every decision made mattered, and in most cases, you will see the full consequences of them. In addition, the writing team did a fantastic job from start to finish in terms of connecting elements of the story. As I went back to relook at certain cutscenes and re-record them without music, the writer's dedication to keep consistency within their storyline is staggering. You may think you find plot holes at first, but later you understand that no, that's exactly what the writers intended. It feels woven with a stitcher's touch. The game also takes several opportunities to try to teach you about some statistical theories and quantum physics of all things. And these segments, well, they go into a lot of detail. And coming from a mathematical and computer science background, I love that it works this kind of material into the plot and explains it in a down-to-earth way. If you want a game that will make you think about your own life and existence as a whole, then Zero Time Dilemma is right up your alley. However, it can be a little bit too much at times. Look, I love to talk about science and all, but here's the thing. It took some air out of the actual events while doing it. Something huge just happened, for example, and these characters who are giving all this exposition and explanation of events feel like they're unaffected by what just happened. There's being calm in the face of chaos, and then there's being disconnected. And with all the game attempts to juggle in terms of its plot, there are a couple of actions that certain characters take that really don't make sense. Certain subplots seem to go absolutely nowhere at times between the different timelines, and frankly, certain characters' entire existence rely on those subplots. It does hurt the character progression and build-up, and that's probably where Zero Time Dilemma is the weakest. A lot of these characters, they just don't have the charisma to really stand out on their own, or connections to truly care about them. Now, I will go into the connections with certain characters later on, but overall, everything seems really toned down in terms of these characters' personalities. Now look, I'm not expecting over the top, but frankly, some of these characters really don't feel like they're affected by the situation at all, and regardless of their backstories, it's sometimes hard to swallow. The most interesting group in the context of this specific game is Q-Team in terms of personalities. They hit a wider range of backgrounds and emotions, with Mira having a mysterious element to her with her slight change in personal traits at times, to Eric dealing with his troubling childhood and his past. Then there's the obvious Q, who you don't know who he is, and is the only child involved in the game. That's a really bold move, as it adds an interesting element with his innocence being added into the moral mix. These characters, they felt the most real and affected by this deadly game, unlike C Team and D Team. Now, those who have played the first 2 games in the series will indicate there's a reason for that. And to be clear, I've played 9 hours, 9 persons, and 9 doors, but not finished it. And I've not played Virtue's Last Reward. For the sake of this review, I did research it, however, and got a consultation from other people who had played this series, that being James G over at TechRaptor, in addition to a nice summary video done by the guys over at Suggestive Gaming. I'll link both of their works in the description below. Basically, while 999 does introduce the characters of Junpei and Akane, I found that the game did a reasonable job of translating their past story, and you don't lose too much if you didn't play the first game. You still gain something though, in particular with Junpei and his experiences. So for those who have played 999, I'm going to give a slight enhancer, as you will benefit from playing it, I just don't think it's required. However, things are completely different in terms of VLR. You don't need the events of the game to truly understand what's going on in Zero Time Dilemma, but the bigger missing element here are the characters of D Team, in particular Sigma and Phi. They are the main protagonists of VLR, and from my understanding and talking to James, their characters' backstories and experiences make the events of Zero Escape that much more impactful. There's a huge enhancer here if you've played VLR, which shouldn't be shocking considering, well, if you played the first 2 games, how the hell are you not going to play the third in this series? Overall, the story is great, even with my issues with it. You will get hooked to the end, and you will enjoy it. And it definitely continues my love of Spike Chunsoft's writing team, even if I question their stability and sanity. Moving right along, you can tell that the game's presentation came from its 3DS and Vita roots, because compared to other $40 games on Steam, the graphics, yeah, they're a bit underwhelming. Now, with the understanding that the game was ported for more people to be able to experience the game, I'm not going to hold that against the game in terms of its score. However, I do still have some complaints in context of the 3DS and Vita versions with the hardware they had available. The character designs are okay, even if several of them are supposed to be low-key. I in particular like Zero's and Q's design, and there's enough little details in other characters to really enjoy their unique aspects. Actually, come to think of it, there's a really weird emphasis on the jewelry elements. They seem to have more detail than everything else. Strange, but overall, the textures aren't that great to begin with, and I've seen better 3D textures on the 3DS before. But the environments are nice to look at, and have good variety within them, while still being appropriate to the tone being set here. But by far, the worst part of Zero Time Dilemma is its animations. I truly wonder if this presentation was intentional at times, because the death scenes in particular feel like they're out of a B-movie. I'll link an example in the description below and via an annotation to an unlisted video for those who want to see an example death, so I don't spoil anything. But the animations, they are just awful. They are stiff, they lack any sort of human, realistic motion, and it can immediately take you out of the story's immersion. I don't understand who thought this looked reasonable in terms of presentation, but that person needs to get their eyes checked. This isn't just 1 or 2 scenes either. Even basic conversations at times have facial expressions that just don't look right. Sound-wise, it's okay. It's reasonable within the puzzles and exploration part of the game, making appropriate sounds to give you feedback of what you're doing. But in cutscenes, the sound should really be taking a more active role in the presentation, and it doesn't. If a liquid is draining down a drain, for example, I expect an appropriate sound here, but it's usually missing. It really misses out on that immersion factor. The game includes both English and Japanese voice acting, and I want to focus on the English one in terms of criticism. The English voice acting is one that may off-put people at first, due to a lack of reaction from several of the characters in terms of the initial plot points and the situations they've been put in. As time goes on, you'll realize exactly why some of the characters are played that way, and it becomes a lot less of an issue towards the middle third and end of the game. I do think, however, the Japanese voice acting fits better in terms of the plot, but obviously, I didn't exactly know what they were saying. It's not horrible in terms of the English voice acting. There's still a couple of moments where the tone set didn't feel right, but I've heard a lot worse in the genre. Just expect some bad screams, in particular with the death scenes. That's the worst of them. Music, on the other hand, is appropriate, that's for sure. It's a deeply dark story, and the somber music and haunting melodies complement the plot fantastically. It never feels out of place emotionally, even when the heroes are able to get themselves out of a terrifying situation. Take a listen.
Hey, are you sure you're all right?
It was a bad dream.
Okay, how about the actual PC port? It's serviceable, but I do have several issues here. Performance-wise, the game does well here. No frame drops or odd visual weirdness of any sort, thankfully. And the controls for the most part do work here for both a controller or for a mouse. I do wish the game did a better job of telling you about the keyboard shortcuts, as several of them would have been lovely to know early on in the game. I'm looking at you, Quick Item Switch. Sadly, there's no good labels used when you use the mouse and keyboard, which is a shame. You usually have to go to the help menu to find the key in question, which is annoying, especially when I decided that the keyboard and mouse was better suited for the game due to the mouse controls on specific puzzles. Where I have the bigger problem here is the little implementation details. They may seem nice to have in several cases. For example, when the game wants you to enter a word in, you have to use the mouse interface and not the keyboard. And when I have to enter 6 words in a row, that seems like a drastic oversight. I'd also like to have seen the note screen be able to actually use the keyboard as well, as trying to write something out with the mouse has an accuracy of putting butter on your hands and attempting to play with a Wii remote control. And as you will find out in the gameplay section of this review, that note screen will be rather important. Now at first, it will seem like the game also has this tendency to forget the settings for things like the volume controls. But on further inspection, it's because it saves locally to the saved game and not at the higher overall level. So if you make an options change, immediately save your game. Now look, I'll say it again. It's nice to see that the game got ported to Steam, and it's generally playable. I've seen a lot worse ports than this. But to be frank, it does need a bit of a tune-up, especially at the small details standpoint. Alright, let's finally talk about the gameplay. As I mentioned, this game is part visual novel and part puzzle game. They mix together to make the overall narrative, but let's focus on parts at a time. Now, the most active portion of the game is when the game requires you to escape a room that you are trapped in. Basically, you go around point-and-click adventure style, bashing items that you found in the room against other items, while solving small riddles and mini-puzzles along the way. Thankfully, these sections are able to complement the story segments in question, and mostly are able to challenge you without being highly frustrating. In terms of the various rooms that you're trapped in and the puzzles you'll run across, there's a reasonable variety here, ranging from being able to visually find something in the background, to math and logic puzzles that will test your deductive reasoning. While there are a few puzzles that will get reused from time to time, it never got old for me. Interactable items are easy to see, despite the lack of a highlight all interactables button here. And you're never really questioning whether or not you missed something in terms of the room items themselves. In addition, the game does a good job of giving you hints when you are missing a critical element to move on in a room, as well as giving you a hint if you just don't understand what a clue is giving you. It never directly tells you the answer, but also realizes that yeah, everyone's gonna miss something now and again, so here's a bone. The logic is also relatively straightforward in terms of the interactables. You're not at levels of grim fandango here. If you have a freezing extinguisher, for example, you know pretty much what you're going to use it for, even if it's a tiny bit unconventional. It doesn't force a stretch of logic like some games do in the genre, and that's nice to see. Now, mathematicians and CS majors, be aware you've seen several of these puzzles before, and you're going to probably get less out of this because of that. because, well, you'll know the solution right away at times. That is a dehancer, but it's a small one at that. Now, are there times that you'll get stuck? Yeah, you will. In terms of the rooms, they are probably the best in terms of avoiding that pitfall, as there was only truly one room that I ran across that really caused me to come to a screeching halt in terms of progress. I couldn't figure out exactly where the keypad combination in this room was located and how to get it. In fact, I spent about an hour and a half in this room. Now, this is rare in terms of the context of the game. Most everything is doable with a little bit of perseverance and a bit of elbow grease. As to the mini puzzles, aka the small puzzles to unlock doors or move on in a room, they are appropriate in terms of time and length. You're not going to sit there for 30 minutes trying to figure it out, at least if you're actually thinking about the puzzle. In particular, I like the arrangement puzzles with the confined spaces. It rewarded smart thinking in terms of understanding the piece size and where the X's were arranged, without needing overly complicated mechanics. But in the overall fragment flowchart, that's where things get a bit more frustrating. Now, as I mentioned before, you'll have to jump back and forth between the different fragments and timelines in the game. And in some cases, you'll need information that you can't get on your current branch, or you'll need to unlock a new fragment by completing another. But here's the thing, sometimes the element that you need to complete in order to unlock the next section isn't clear. Sure, you'll get exclamation points for ones that are new and that you need to do, but for those getting stuck in the game, I would advise that you focus on these fragments that are off on the side here. You'd think that with them being off and not on the path, that they wouldn't be important. And you'd be dead wrong. Like most things in the game, you'll need to experience these before you can go forward. Also, word of advice for someone who played through this game: bring a notepad. The game wants you to remember codes and elements that you need to use between the different timelines. Be sure to label everything that you write down. Don't just write down a number code, for example, because guess what? There's going to be a bunch of different number codes. Now, on one hand, it does give you this detective type feeling when you have to connect the right information with the right section. But maybe I just got lazy, but I wish that the game would just store the information in a local file and tell me what I found. In the end, Spike Chunsoft has another great story in Zero Escape, Zero Time Dilemma, one that has twists, turns, and enough drama to rival a Shakespearean play. The world is interesting and its puzzles force you to think outside the box. However, this just isn't on the same level as Danganronpa 2, as the game stumbles with some of its characters, and the presentation just doesn't complement the story well at times. It's definitely worth a purchase for those who want to challenge their minds and want to question their own existence. But from a base score standpoint, it clocks in at an 86 out of 100, making it a solid buy unless you're hurting for cash. However, like always, you have to consider the enhancers. It's my unique twist on the review genre, taking into account more subjective tastes of the gamers who may play this in question. If you strongly identify with an enhancer category, then add or subtract the score to your overall score. If you have any questions about the review system, always refer to the review scoring video that I'll link in an annotation here or down below. In this case, there's a reasonable amount of enhancers, and if it isn't clear that those who played VLR or 999 should probably play this game, well, I don't know what to tell you. Finally, I'm going on record to end this review. This review was really hard. Being careful of what I might spoil in terms of plot, while still being able to give enough information for you to get something out of this review, yeah, that was really hard. I struggled to bring the review together to begin with, but hopefully you find the product useful. And if you find the product useful, maybe hit that subscribe button, or consider keeping this channel going via the Patreon. Thanks for watching, and as always, keep on gaming. Thanks for watching. Like the video, share it with a friend, and subscribe if you want more content like this. In the description below, you'll find the Steam review accompanying this vid, along with social media that you can follow me on, Twitter, Google+, and Facebook groups. And if you want to support the channel, click that Patreon on the left of the screen. And remember, keep on gaming.